My sister has a phrase that she likes to use sometimes when I try to deny an offer for her help. She'll say, "James, let me have my charity." Sometimes the generous thing to do is to receive other people's goodness graciously. In our first reading, Naaman the Syrian is healed through God's grace at the guidance of the prophet Elisha. And perhaps you're familiar with the background of Naaman's story. He's a foreigner who traveled a very long distance to come and seek out the prophet to try and be healed from his affliction. And he was also very skeptical and doubtful of God's ability to heal him at all when he first received Elisha's instructions because they were so seemingly normal. Elisha told him simply to go wash in the river Jordan. And he kind of balked at this. He thought surely God's healing would require some special invocation or gesture or action. And the plainness, the simplicity of Elisha's instruction causes him to kind of object a little bit. But he eventually follows the instruction and is healed of his affliction. And so as a result, you can imagine that he felt very humbled and maybe even a little embarrassed when he returns to the prophet and has been healed. And we hear that he tries to pay Elisha back, to pay God back by offering an offering, but Elisha prohibits him from doing so. You might ask, which is harder, to give or to receive? We're probably inclined to say, oh, it's obviously much harder to give something away than to receive a gift, but I'm not so sure. Sometimes it's much harder for us to freely receive the goodness and charity of others, and especially of God, than it is for us to be generous and giving ourselves. A few years back, I had the privilege to spend a summer as a hospital chaplain intern right at Upstate here in Syracuse, and I had the privilege to visit many patients during that summer. And over again, I heard a very similar phrase or expression. The patient would say, all of my life, I have been the one who takes care of other people, and now I feel helpless, and it is very hard to have other people take care of me. The fact of the matter is that it is often very hard to receive generosity or service from someone else and not be able to pay them back in some way. We don't really like feeling beholden to others. Sometimes we're afraid of perhaps it coming back to bite us like some kind of unpaid debt. And sometimes I would talk with patients who had so much trouble with this that they would even become even bitter or resentful towards their caregivers. They would be difficult to work with or unkind to the nurses and staff and demanding. And the temptation was to get angry at them for not being grateful. But I think what was often going on, or at least in some cases, was that they were rebelling against being dependent on others. They felt humiliated by having to need help and having to receive it graciously. In our gospel today, Jesus heals 10 lepers from their very painful and humiliating disease, and only one of them comes back to thank him. Perhaps the other 9 were like those patients in the hospital, too discouraged by their weakness to be grateful. But our gospel and our first reading both teach us this valuable and helpful lesson to say thank you. We should thank those who help to care for us, and we should especially offer thanks and gratitude to God. This is really Elisha's lesson to Naaman in our first reading, that he doesn't need to repay the Lord for God's goodness as though he can break even with God. Instead, what Naaman does is he takes 2 loads of dirt with him back to his homeland that he can continue to offer gratitude to God, that he can continue to thank God for his goodness. And it's important to note that this is not simply a matter of good etiquette to say thank you to God. In fact, this is a kind of secret to holiness and the spiritual life. Again, in that first story, Naaman balked at first, thinking that to be healed, he would have to do something very special and esoteric to be healed. And sometimes we might think that to be holy, to be saints, to follow God requires some sort of extreme knowledge or secret path of holiness. But the answer is quite simple, just as the answer was very simple for Naaman. At the heart of holiness is, in fact, this simple, very straightforward gesture of thanking God for his goodness. When we take time to thank God for his generosity and his grace, it has a powerful effect on our spiritual life and our relationship with Jesus. Also, it is in thanking God that we're then healed of that temptation to resent our dependence. Thanking God for his grace heals our hearts and our minds and allows us to learn to rely on God as our loving Father. And this is the key to holiness, because when we rely on God as our Father, this in turn allows us to be great disciples and eventually saints. All the saints shared this characteristic in common. They thanked God for his goodness to them. The saints were very intentional on calling to mind how God had been generous, how God had been present in their life. We might think that the saints would be the ones to be most preoccupied with their own accomplishments and what they had done and what they had offered to God, but it's the opposite. St. Teresa of Avila says, "Everything is gift." She recognized God's incredible and overwhelming generosity, and it was this conviction that led to her whole life of holiness and everything that followed afterwards. And so the saints gradually learned to rely on the Lord and rejoice in his generosity rather than resist it or become fiercely independent. And this is maybe a challenge in our culture today. We like our independence. We sometimes can hold on to our self-reliance. And so maybe you struggle with this, to receive help and support graciously. And if you do, and all of us receive God's grace and help and rely on him, so it's a challenge for all of us on some level. But if you find yourself struggling in that way, perhaps you can think about it in a little bit different manner, which may help. While you and I may feel like we have nothing to give in return to a caregiver or someone who's been generous to us, we actually do. You have control over how you respond. You can, in fact, be generous by graciously receiving their care and support. And this is no small thing. Sometimes it's much harder to give gratitude than it is to give money or time or service. And so this is a great gift that only you can offer, only the patient at the hospital can offer, only the person needing help can offer, a gift of gratitude. Not a material gift, but rather a spiritual one. We should never underestimate the power of this gift. For children, thanking their parents; for students, thanking their teachers; and for each of us, thanking the Lord for his generosity. And so to put it very plainly, we just have to simply stop resisting the Lord's goodness and his generosity, whether it comes directly from him or through the ordinary means of people who are caring for us. Let the Lord have his charity, as my sister would say. And in doing so, we'll discover the freedom that comes from depending on him. There's one other little detail about our gospel that we can conclude with. Jesus told the 10 lepers to go and show themselves to the priest, and the one returns to him. And there's a deeper theological truth at work here. It points to the fact that Jesus himself is the high priest. What does a priest do? At the very heart of the Mass, of the Eucharistic sacrifice, is offering all things to God. So often in the Mass, you'll hear the word thanks or thanksgiving over and over again. Our celebration here in the Mass is about thanking God for his goodness, giving him thanks and praise. And so as we continue with this Mass, let's be intentional about calling to mind the Lord's goodness and his generosity, thanking him for all that he has given us, and committing ourselves to being intentional about cultivating that gratitude in our hearts.